Put your hands where I can see them right now. That's what he said to me loud enough that the sound bounced off the gas pumps and came back like an echo, and I remember thinking in that exact second, well, this is either going to be a quick misunderstanding or one of those nights you never forget. I didn't know yet it would end with cuffs digging into my wrists under a buzzing canopy light while a stranger filmed from the sidewalk and a young officer stood in front of me acting like he'd just caught the villain in a crime movie. Yeah, that happened. It was just before 10 at night, one of those quiet roadside stations where the world feels paused, except for the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the faraway rush of highway tires. And I'd pulled in because my fuel light had been glaring at me for 10 miles straight, like it had something personal against me. I was tired, hungry still, in plain clothes after a long shift, cardigan jeans, comfortable shoes, nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious unless pumping gas suddenly became a felony. I remember the smell of gasoline hanging in the air, the concrete still warm from the day, and the way the windows of the little convenience store glowed like squares of white against the dark. I was calm, scanning the lot out of habit. Not paranoia, just training. You never really turn off once you've spent decades in law enforcement. Then I saw flashing lights reflected in the chrome of the pump and thought maybe someone needed directions or something minor. But the cruiser rolled in fast-angled, sharp spotlight snapping on like I'd just stepped onto a stage I didn't audition for. And before I could even turn fully toward him, the door slammed and he was striding over, already talking. Step away from the vehicle. No greeting, no context, just command. I looked at him and said, "Steady, respectful, evening, officer, what seems to be the problem?" And I swear you could see irritation flicker across his face like I'd insulted him instead of asked a normal question. He said I matched a description, told me to show my ID voice, tight, impatient, the tone of someone who'd decided how this scene would go before it even started. Now, most people in that moment would reach straight for their wallet, and I don't blame them. Nobody wants trouble at a gas station at night. But something in his delivery told me this wasn't about information. It was about control. And when you've worked the job as long as I have, you learn the difference real quick. So I asked him calm as I could, am I being detained or is this a consensual conversation? And that question hit him like a pebble hitting glass. He blinked, jaw flexed, said, "Don't lawyer me, just give me your ID." And I said, "I'm not trying to be difficult. I just need to know your legal basis because that matters. It matters a lot more than people think." And suddenly his whole posture changed. Shoulders stiff, voice sharper, hand drifting toward his cuffs, like metal would solve what words couldn't. He said it was a detention. I asked what crime he suspected. He said I was refusing a lawful order. I said asking for clarification isn't refusal. And you could feel the air shift like a storm rolling in you didn't see on the forecast. He stepped closer, too close, and said, "Last chance," and I told him quietly, "Call your supervisor. Not dramatic, not loud, just matter of fact." Because that's procedure when things start escalating for no reason. And that sentence, that simple request, seemed to snap something inside him. "I don't need a supervisor," he shot back, and I nodded once because that told me everything I needed to know about where his head was at. Understood. I said so. "You're choosing to proceed without oversight," and I saw his patience vanish like smoke. "Hands behind your back," he ordered, and I stayed still. Hands visible. Voice, "Even, officer. I'm not resisting. I'm not threatening you. You haven't articulated reasonable suspicion." And before I could finish, he grabbed my wrist hard. Not guiding, not professional, just a grab. My body shifted with the pull, but I didn't jerk away, didn't shove him, didn't raise my voice. Instead, I did what training teaches you when things go sideways. I narrated. "You're grabbing my wrist without cause," I said. "Clearly I'm not resisting." And I saw a man walking out of the store freeze mid-step with a soda in his hand, like he'd just walked into the wrong scene of a movie. The officer snapped at him to back up. The man did, but he didn't leave. He watched, and I could tell he knew something about this wasn't right. The officer twisted my arm behind my back, told me to get on the ground, my shoulder pressed against my SUV, and I said, "Steady. You're about to make a serious mistake," because I could see where this was heading and it wasn't somewhere he wanted to go. Into the mic, I've got an uncooperative. Into the mic, I've got an uncooperative subject, possible theft suspect, refusing commands. And I remember thinking possible theft, really? Because seconds ago it was suspicious person, and I said out loud, "You said suspicious person." Before now it's theft. Which is it? He ignored me and snapped the cuffs on, fast, tight ratchet, clicking more times than it needed to. Metal biting into skin, and I said, "Those are too tight. Please double lock them and loosen them," and he smirked like he'd been waiting his whole shift for someone to say that. Should have thought about that before resisting, he said, and I told him I'm not resisting, you're escalating, but by then he was already walking me toward his patrol car, gravel crunching under our shoes. The bystander silent near the curb pump, still humming behind us like it didn't know anything unusual was happening. That's when I told him my name and my job title, calm, clear, not dramatic, just fact. And he stopped for a second, just long enough for reality to knock on the door. Then he laughed and said, "Yeah, sure you are," like disbelief could rewrite the moment. I told him he could verify it. Call dispatch, call a supervisor. Please don't keep going down this road, and instead he pushed me toward the back seat harder than necessary, and I spoke toward his chest camera because by then I knew that lens was the only neutral witness in the lot. For the record, I said, "You haven't stated a crime, you haven't articulated reasonable suspicion, and you're using force." And he leaned in close and told me to be quiet, voice low and angry, and I said, just as calm, "You're emotionally escalated, your commands are inconsistent, you're not in control of yourself," and that hit him harder than yelling ever could. He shoved my head down to get me into the seat. Impatient, rough, and I said, "You just pushed my head. That was unnecessary." And he shouted, "Stop resisting," and I told him, "I'm trying to sit without injuring my shoulder," because that was the truth. Then headlights swept across the lot and another unit pulled in, and the officer who stepped out didn't rush, didn't bark, didn't posture. He walked like someone who actually wanted to understand what was happening before deciding what it meant. He took in the scene, the cuffs, the bystander, the tension practically humming in the air, and he asked, "What's going on?" And the first officer answered, quick words tumbling over each other. Suspicious subject refused. ID combative claims. She's a chief. And the second officer looked at me. Really looked, not defensive, just assessing, and said, "Ma'am," and I met his eyes and said, "Sergeant, I'm Chief Carter. I'm requesting you take over this scene," and he didn't react with surprise or sarcasm. He just keyed his radio and asked dispatch to confirm my identity. The first officer scoffed. Behind him said I was lying. But the sergeant didn't argue, didn't debate, just waited for verification like procedure says to do. And when dispatch came back and confirmed it, you could feel the whole atmosphere change like a switch flipped, and suddenly everyone remembered the rulebook existed. The sergeant stepped forward, checked the cuffs, loosened them carefully, and the relief in my wrists felt like someone turning off a vice. "Thank you," I said, and he told the first officer to step back to his unit, voice calm but firm, and you could see the younger guy hesitate like he wanted to protest but thought better of it. A lieutenant arrived minutes later, scanned the scene, listened while I explained exactly what happened, no drama, just facts, and then he turned to the officer and said, "Secure your body cam." And that's when it finally hit him. You could see it in his face that the camera he thought was protecting him had actually been recording every decision he made. By the next morning, I had already photographed the marks on my wrists, written down the timeline, documented the phrases I remembered because evidence matters more than emotion always has, and by afternoon, Internal Affairs had the footage, by evening, command staff had watched it. And when a room full of supervisors sits in silence after a video, you don't need anyone to explain what that means. The original call that sent him there turned out to be nothing. Just someone saying a woman was standing near cars, no crime, no threat, no details, and compared to what he'd radioed in about a resisting theft suspect, it didn't line up, not even close. Policy violations stacked up, fast detention without reasonable suspicion, force without necessity, failure to call a supervisor, inaccurate reporting. And the investigation moved quickly because the camera didn't blink, didn't forget, didn't pick sides, it just showed what happened. A month later, he was fired, 6 years on the job, gone because he couldn't slow down, couldn't explain his actions, couldn't separate authority from ego. And people argued about it like they always do. Some saying I should have just shown ID, others asking if it could happen to me. What happens to someone who doesn't know their rights, and me? I went back to work and used it as a lesson, telling my officers calm isn't disrespect and questions aren't threats, reminding them professionalism isn't optional. It's the whole job. So now, I want to ask you something honestly. If you'd been standing there that night watching it unfold under those lights, would you have thought he was doing his job or losing control of it? And what would you have done in my place? Because stories like this don't really end when the cuffs come off. They end when people decide what they believe is right. So tell me in the comments what you think, whose side you're on, and why.